Well, hello. Good evening. Welcome to New York AAPOR's kickoff event of the 2023-2024 season. I hope you could all hear me. I am Patrick Hoey, the current president of New York AAPOR for this term. And I'd like to once again welcome you to our kickoff event featuring Professor John Green from Duke University, who will talk to us about his Public Opinion Quarterly article on this very timely topic, presidential primaries, public opinion, and strategic voting. Before we begin, I would like to thank our generous sponsors, without whom these events would not be, we would not be able to run these events. At the gold level, I'd like to thank IBM, NORC at the University of Chicago, Ovations MR, Recon MR, and SSRS. At the silver level, I would like to thank Edison Research, EDC, Global Strategy Group, Ivy Execs, and Queens College. Their MA program is very good. At the bronze level, Bauman Research, Marketing Systems Group, and a handful collection of individual donors. We thank you very much. Upcoming events of New York AAPOR in a very busy schedule. In October, using GPT for market research. In November 13th, an event in partnership with the Roper Center Warren Matofsky Award celebration. The Strengthening Democracy Challenge, featuring Professor Rob Willer of Stanford. And then a number of different kinds of events that New York AAPOR is running this year. We will be small discussion clubs on timely topics that appear in Public Opinion Quarterly and other media, having to do with our profession, survey research. A busy schedule also is being planned for January through June of 2024. Rules of the road. All attendees are currently muted. Please do not unmute yourself while the presenter is speaking. We're going to hold questions until the end of the presentation. You can type them into the chat, but we will also open it to we'll have an open mic towards the conclusion of the event in our question and answer period. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Greg Bovitz, our programming committee chairperson, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Really excited to welcome Professor John Green to New York AAPOR as our featured guest speaker tonight. John Green is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Duke University. Prior to joining the department this summer, he was a senior research scientist at the Network Science Institute at Northeastern University and a fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. In addition to the paper in POQ that he's discussing today, John's scholarship on American politics has been published in journals such as Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the British Journal of Political Science, and Political Behavior. He's also the co-author of Machine Learning for Experiments in the Social Sciences, a Cambridge element offering a practical introduction to machine learning for experimental researchers. Welcome, Professor Green, and we'll turn the floor over to you for your presentation.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Greg, for that introduction, and to New York AAPOR for having me. Just share my screen really quickly here. Full screen. Great. Yeah, so thanks everyone for coming as well. Hopefully you can all hear me. My name is John Green. Like they said, I'm a new assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Duke University. I'm still getting used to being called that, but so it is. And this is some work that I published in POQ with fantastic co-authors, Brian Schaffner at Tufts and Samantha Lukes at YouGov. And I'm going to talk about the paper itself, and I'm going to close with some sort of looking ahead to the 2024 primaries to see if and what implications we might expect. So big picture, this paper is part of a broader question of how parties go about deciding who to nominate for their presidential elections, and especially in the context of parties being relatively weak, having not so much direct control in the smoke-filled room over who they nominate. A lot of this falls to primary voters, party activists, politically engaged citizens who need to who task themselves with making decisions about these nomination choices. And I think it's really helpful here to start with Seth Maskett's book, and he really wrote the book on the 2020 Democratic primary. In-depth interviews with party activists and primary voters on how they were thinking about their decision in the 2020 election. And one of the big takeaways from Seth's work is that political parties try to adapt from one election to the next. They try to learn from their mistakes, but they can only adapt to the mistakes they think they've made. So the stories that parties tell themselves about why they lost in one election are going to be really informative for how they adapt and how they behave in subsequent elections. And when we're thinking about the 2016 election, this is an extremely close election. It's decided by about a football stadium's, or less, sorry, a tenth of a football stadium, 80,000 votes, split across 3 states. So there are a lot of plausible reasons why that election turned out the way it did. You might think that the fundamentals would have predicted a really close election regardless of who the candidates were, right? So given the economic indicators, given that the Democratic Party is going for a 3rd consecutive term, that this election was always going to be close, regardless of anything who the candidates were, what they did, things of that nature. We also have a relatively establishment-oriented candidate, right? Former Democratic senator, wife of a former president, running against someone who has never held public office before. And you might think that there was a latent sort of anti-establishment populist sentiment in the electorate that was going to advantage that outsider candidate. There might have been specific policy issues that were salient in the 2016 election that split the Democratic coalition, right? So on immigration and on trade, you might think that this put the Democrats on a weak sort of issue space footing relative to if the election had been about something else on issues they might have owned more directly. Might have thought that Hillary Clinton might have been an uninspiring candidate, failed to mobilize, get Democrats enthusiastic about her candidacy, and this would have contributed to low turnout. You could also point to specific strategic considerations that the Clinton campaign did or didn't make. So Hillary Clinton didn't go to Wisconsin, right? This gets thrown around as a reason why she lost that state. Or we can blame it on the ground game. We didn't turn out enough of our core supporters right when it counted. We have a series of narratives around scandal, right? The aura of sort of impropriety around a private email server. We get the Comey letter dropping right before election time. There's a broader set of considerations around Russian interference and sort of aspersions being cast around her general integrity, right? So these are all different reasons that people are throwing out there for why the 2016 election turned out the way it did. And I've actually left out the big one, right? Identity. Hillary Clinton is not only running to be the first woman president, but she makes identity issues more salient in the campaign, right? So that making issues such as race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, sort of running on those issues, in addition to being sort of high salience figure sort of for descriptive representation in the Oval Office. And after the election, there's a lot of finger pointing around this exact issue, that sort of if the Democratic Party had run on more traditional bread and butter economic issues, the 2016 election wouldn't have turned out the way it did. And so identity is sort of another narrative that's out there for what we can blame for the 2016 election. This is made salient explicitly during the 2020 campaign. So on a debate stage, Elizabeth Warren says that in private, Bernie Sanders had told her up front that he didn't think a woman could win the presidency in 2020, put Sanders on the defensive on this issue, and makes this exact question of the demographic characteristics of who we nominate newly salient in 2020 after it is a point of contention in the aftermath of that 2016 election. So you might be wondering, I'm a political scientist. I've read a bunch of literature on the 2016 election. Do we have an answer on which of these narratives is correct? Who's right in all of these debates? And for the purposes of what the Democratic Party is going to do in 2020, it actually doesn't matter who's objectively correct in the answer to this question. For what it's worth, there's actually very limited evidence that candidates' demographics, sort of on race and gender in particular, serve as penalties in general elections, sort of conditional on being nominated. Women and candidates of color tend to do about as well as white and male candidates in the modern era. And I can talk in the Q&A about why we think that is. But what does matter is what 2020 primary voters believe about what happened in 2016, right? Who can win the argument, whether or not they're objectively correct, is going to structure how the Democratic Party adapts in 2020. And as Seth Maskett argues, this narrative about identity, Clinton's gender, and making identity issues salient takes hold as a big component of what 2020 primary voters think went wrong in 2016. And if that's the case, then the natural adaptation would be to nominate a white man in 2020, net of all of the other considerations that you might think matter for who general election voters vote for. Now, I mention who general election voters vote for because this is one of the key concerns in primary elections, not considerations about what you want necessarily. Might think of these as first order preferences. What do I want? Do I want cake or ice cream tonight for dessert, say? But primary elections are about second order preferences. Right? What do I think other people want? Do I think you would prefer cake or ice cream for dessert? And this is, we're thinking about primary elections, extremely important. Right? We're not just considering who we think would make the best president. We're trying to pick someone who the general election median voter is going to vote for. And this is going to change our calculus for how we behave in that election. We're not just picking our most preferred candidate. This is very familiar, right? If you've heard of strategic voting, you get the intuition here that primary election voters are more than happy to sacrifice some policy proximity to the candidate who's closest to them in exchange for nominating someone who is more viable, is not going to lose to the out-party opponent. But typically in this literature, we think about electability in terms of ideology, in terms of location in a latent left-right policy space. So I'm gonna forego my preferences for super liberal candidate in exchange for more middle of the road moderate candidate who's on policy, who's more appealing in that single latent dimension. But in 2020, we get a lot more variation in candidates' demographic backgrounds. And we get a novel theory from Regina Bateson, who's a political scientist by training, but actually ran for office in 2018 and personally experienced this, that primary election voters, party activists, donors, volunteers, things of that nature, have reservations about particular candidates, not on policy grounds, but on identity grounds, saying, look, I'm not sexist, but I'm worried that you will have a hard time in a general election because other voters are sexist. You're going to get penalized in the general election. So Bateson develops this theory of strategic discrimination that occurs when voters penalize a candidate out of concern that other people are going to discriminate on the basis of some aspect of their identity. So in her paper, she has a couple findings. One that in a nationally representative sample, hypothetical white men are seen as more electable. In a Democratic primary context, electability salience reduces support for Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren. And then she tests out some strategies of how to mitigate these effects and find some interesting, has some interesting findings on providing counterexamples. So Lauren Underwood is a woman of color, wins a congressional seat in a swing district outside of Chicago. And if you tell people about this counterexample, you can reduce the effects of these strategic considerations. All right, so really interesting paper. I highly encourage you to go check it out. This is also consistent with both prior work on local party elites. So in an experimental setting, local party chairs are less likely to say that they would recruit women and candidates of color out of this exact concern. And then subsequent work on electability salience show that this reduced support or vote intention for candidates from underrepresented backgrounds. So what we're doing in this paper is seeing if we can replicate the core idea, replicate strategic discrimination in a slightly different setting. So it's a conceptual replication, not a straight replication here, but we're going to do a couple different things. So one, we're going to get a high quality sample of likely Democratic primary voters. So we have a 3000N survey fielded through YouGov in collaboration with Data for Progress. Full disclosure, I was a founding board member of Data for Progress, although I'm no longer affiliated. And we do this in June of 2019 as the race is taking shape. So right as the Democratic primary race is heating up, we field a big survey of likely Democratic primary voters, and we run a conjoint design testing hypothetical primary candidates against one another. So rather than running Joe Biden against Elizabeth Warren, we're going to run a hypothetical randomly generated profile who happens to be a white man versus a hypothetical randomly generated profile who happens to be a white woman, for example. And then substantively, we're going to see if we can extend this core finding in a couple ways. So one, we're interested in whether these strategic considerations do spill over into first order preferences, right? Are concerns about electability affecting that first order choice? And then second, we're going to see if we can separate these strategic discrimination considerations from good old-fashioned hostile sexism and racial resentment. Right? Is the second order consideration fundamentally different from first order considerations, or are people who are engaging in strategic discrimination the same people who would be engaging in just regular discrimination? So the attributes we vary are right here. It's sort of in this table. We vary some demographic characteristics: gender, race, age. We vary some policy positions: climate, health. We vary proposed general election strategy. So is this a candidate who's going to try to win over moderates who might have voted for Trump in 2016? Or is this a candidate who's going to try to energize the base and turn out people who didn't vote in 2016? And then we're going to vary the background. Is this a candidate who's more associated with the establishment, or are they more of an outsider? We pose two hypothetical profiles to these respondents, and we ask them two questions. One, if you had to choose between these two candidates, who would you prefer as the Democratic nominee? This is our first order preference. Who do you want between these two candidates? And they can pick between one or the other. And then second, we say, okay, outside of your consideration, regardless of who you would prefer, who do you think has a better chance, or who do you think would beat Donald Trump in a general election matchup? And here, respondents can say one, the other, both, or neither. All right, so you're allowed to say, I don't think either of these candidates would win, or I think either of these candidates would win, but you do get to say, I think candidate A would win and B wouldn't, or vice versa. We ask each respondent to evaluate 5 of these matchups, and this helps us get a little more precision and a bigger sample as well, and we can adjust for that statistically on the back end. All right, for the purposes of this paper, we're interested in these two attributes, right, race and gender, to see if first order and second order preferences differ between when these two attributes are varied. So what do we find? at a high level, we replicate the core finding of strategic discrimination. So here's the first order preferences here. If we randomly show a hypothetical profile who's a woman and not a man, likely Democratic primary voters register a first order preference for women over men by about 4 percentage points. They also prefer candidates of color over white candidates, tracking the intuition here. But if we ask, who do you think is more likely to beat Donald Trump, this completely flips around, right? That men and white candidates are seen as more electable, likelier to beat Trump than the women and candidates of color who are preferred in the first order sense. So the first extension here is, can we identify spillover from those electability considerations into the sort of first order preferences? And here we use a mediation analysis. And this makes a strong assumption, what's called sequential ignorability. We have to assume that our treatment is independent of our pre-treatment covariates and our mediating variable. And this is easy in an experiment because we're randomly assigning it. You also have to assume that your mediator, which in this case, the electability considerations, is also independent. And this is a strong assumption. So what I'm showing you here is our sensitivity analysis of that effect. So we do find in the big picture that electability considerations actually reduce what are first order preferences for women and candidates of color. The idea here is, in the absence of electability considerations, we would observe even bigger effects in favor of women and candidates of color as the respondent's first choice. And what I'm showing you here is how wrong those assumptions, the assumption underlying this method, could be before that effect goes away. So we do think this is a fairly robust, small but precisely estimated mediation effect that we think is showing evidence of that spillover. After that, we look at the intersection of race and gender in these profiles. So, and we find that these effects essentially compound, that white male candidates are the least preferred in the first order sense. Women of color are the most preferred in the first order sense. But when we flip that around, white men are also seen as the most electable, and women of color are also seen as the least electable by a fairly substantial margin. Now, the second extension here, can we separate out these strategic discrimination from regular discrimination? And here I'm showing the same results I showed you earlier, but stratified by hostile sexism. It's a battery of questions designed to tap into sexist attitudes. And we find that in sort of first choice preferences, these track in ways you would likely expect, right? That the respondents who score lowest on this battery of questions designed to tap into sexism have the strongest preferences for women over men. Respondents who score really high in hostile sexism actually have weak preferences for men over women. But when we flip this around and ask the electability question, the intercept shifts across these different strata, but the slope stays the same. Regardless of how high you score on this scale, you think that women are less electable than men. So the relationship is constant across these levels, even among those who might most strongly prefer women candidates. We see the same thing for race, that if we stratify by levels of racial resentment, we find that those who score lowest in racial resentment have the strongest preferences for candidates of color. Those who score high in racial resentment prefer white candidates over candidates of color. But everyone agrees that white candidates are more electable than candidates of color. This is independent from those first order racial attitudes. So that's the paper. We think we've replicated and extended Regina Bateson's findings in some interesting ways. Looking ahead, I got asked to think about whether we would see strategic discrimination in 2024. And I want you all to think about that for a second too, before I move forward. My first thought is probably no, right? Just given what the sort of the context of the 2024 primaries and what's going on in the Republican side, what's going on in the Democratic side. I initially didn't think that this was going to be as big of a thing in 2024. But then I saw some takes about Joe Biden's age. And, we don't have a competitive Democratic primary right now for the 2024 election. But if we did, we would be getting quite a bit of discourse about what the general election median voter thinks about Joe Biden's age among people who personally say they think Joe Biden is perfectly competent to be president, that it shouldn't matter for anyone's voting decision, who might think that Joe Biden should continue to be president if they could have their way by themselves, but harbor serious concerns about what the general elections median voter thinks about Joe Biden's age. And this would be, a question for is this an evidence of or an example of strategic discrimination? Now, we're not going to learn the answer to this unless the Democratic primary gets competitive. And if it does become competitive, it would likely be for exactly this reason. But something to think about as we continue to read some takes. On the Republican side, I do think it's important to get back to Seth Maskett's argument that what the Republicans do in 2024 is going to depend a lot on what they think went wrong in 2020. And the best evidence we have so far suggests that the Republican Party is not convinced that they made any mistakes in 2020, that they think that Trump was a good candidate, ran a good campaign, and was foiled at the last minute by a combination of COVID and widespread election fraud. And if that's the case, this would suggest renominating Trump because he's the best candidate for the job. There is the potential for some cracks in that narrative to form, but if they're going to be consequential, they need to start forming pretty quickly, although we'll see how that develops over the next couple rounds of primary debates. In any case, those are my thoughts, and I do want to reserve some time for questions from you all. Thanks very much.
Great, John, thanks so much. Give people a second to feel free to drop questions into the chat. Start there, and then otherwise we can call into people if they want to get into a conversation. We're happy to have some interaction and discussion. I'll start off with one question for you. I know, of course, this research was conducted among Democratic primary voters. We don't have data on Republican primary voters this time around. Obviously, the Trump factor is a major dynamic. Just sort of curious about your hypotheses if we were to run this experiment among Republican primary voters, maybe with Trump in the mix, without Trump in the mix, what you might hypothesize. I know it's speculation, but just curious.
Yeah, so I mean, I would certainly hypothesize that primary voters care about electability, right? In some form or another, everyone knows that you don't get anything you want if you don't win. And so the question is, how do we define electability? Which candidate do we think meets these criteria? And you do see, Republican primary candidates talking about this. One of the more interesting sort of things that came up in the first debate was what should the Republican primary do about abortion now that they've won at the Supreme Court? What do we do about it? And I heard three distinct answers between the different candidates. But it was posed to the candidates as a political issue rather than a moral issue, right? Is that the abortion is costing Republicans electorally. And to the extent you buy that, it suggests that we should nominate a more moderate candidate on abortion, someone who's not going to push for a national ban, say. So Nikki Haley sort of made that argument of this is not worth pursuing. We should be focusing on other issues, trying to take the lower the salience of abortion, because if we nominate a diehard sort of anti-abortion activist, we're going to lose. It's effectively part of the argument there. So I think the sort of interesting thing to vary is what is the dimension on which electability is getting fought in the primary. I'm not sure it would be exactly this, just given the state of the race, but in theory, the mechanism would be similar. I don't know if that answered the question, but
yeah, no, that's terrific. Great, thank you. I'll read the first question in the chat here, and then I've got Kabir up next. But the question in the chat, John, can you tell us about the sex, race, and ethnic distribution of the YouGov sample and how it was weighted?
So I can tell you off the top of my head, I don't know the exact distribution breakdowns. I would refer you to the SM in the paper for the demographics. I will say it was a YouGov sample, and they were waiting to target the Democratic primary electorate. So that's going to be a little bit proprietary to YouGov on how they do that balancing, but we generally trust them. And in any Democratic primary poll you were seeing out of YouGov at the time, it would be consistent with sort of that sample distribution. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you on that.
I think that's a great answer. It's a great answer. Kabir, I want you to share your question.
Nice to see you, John.
Hey.
This is a fascinating paper. I appreciate you walking us through it. You said it wasn't a straight replication, but it was kind of a replication of a conjoint analysis we did in 2019 with basically the same dependent variables. So it's great. I mean, the marginal means and the treatment effects you showed us were very similar to what we saw in that study. And just to be clear, we only asked people in that one, which of these two candidates would you prefer to be the Democratic nominee? So like the less strategic of your two different variables. So that pattern of it flipping when you move to the second is super interesting. I wanted to throw something at you from that survey we did. This is a little unfair because you probably haven't seen it, but after the conjoint, we asked people a bunch of attitudinal questions. And one of them was, what's more important to you in the nominee? Is it more important that it's someone who will inspire Democrats to turn out and vote? Or is it more important that it's someone who will appeal to voters in the middle? And 2/3 took the former option. It's more important to turn out the base. So by 2-1, they're favoring that. So I guess to me, that might suggest a little bit of a contradiction if they're thinking strategically, but also they want to turn out their side. Or maybe it's not a contradiction. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that puzzle. Maybe it has to do with who they're thinking prefers white men. What types of voters they think have that preference down the line.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. I have a lot of thoughts about this. So the first thought is, so we have as an arm in this experiment, I have a backup slide for it. This is the big ugly, all of the marginal means together. And we have that persuade moderates, energize the base arm. And we find sort of in this sort of all the arms competing against each other setting, so not quite the same way, but we find a slight advantage for persuading moderates over energizing the base. But this is masking a substantial amount of heterogeneity under the hood. So there's a really good, I think it's still a working paper. I don't know if it ever got published, but Anton Strezhnev and some colleagues reanalyzed this data using a causal random forest and found that on this arm in particular, you get a lot of polarization on preferences for general election strategy. You have a camp of Democratic primary voters who are convinced that, or they strongly prefer someone who's going to turn out the base, and you have a separate camp of voters, slightly larger, who have really strong preferences for peeling back voters who picked Trump in 2016. And this reflects what I think was a fairly live debate at the time over the trade-off between turnout and persuasion, which I think campaign practitioners might tell you is kind of a false choice, right? Like typically something that is persuasive to swing voters and moderates. Like those don't have to be one or the other. But we were getting arguments, in the discourse about whether swing voters are a myth, they don't exist. We should just focus on people who didn't vote in 2016. And this is, I think, a fairly attractive argument to people who don't want to sacrifice on policy. Right? We don't need to move to the center. All we need to do is turn out folks who didn't show up previously. So I think, I guess my, tying this back to the narratives argument, right? It doesn't matter whether that's who's right in the empirical sense. It matters what the electorate comes to believe. And the electorate was split on this question during that campaign. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but yeah, great.
Got some more questions in the chat here. I can read them for you. From Andrew, is there a way to incorporate name ID as a variable in these kinds of experiments, or is that impossible with this kind of methodology?
Well, first off, hi, Andrew. Good to hear from you. So in the conjoint design, no. We're randomly generating these hypotheticals. They don't have names. It's just candidate A, candidate B. There is, I think one of the just inherent limitations in a design like this is if we are asking this in the context of the 2020 Democratic primary, when we show you a white woman, are you thinking of Elizabeth Warren when you answer that question? And that's just something we have to live with. So there is, I think, the possibility of, I guess that would be demand effects in this context of people having real people in mind when they're being shown these hypothetical profiles. But the profiles themselves don't have name ID, so they can't, or don't have names, so they can't have name ID. Yeah.
Okay. I'll keep going through the questions in the chat, and if people want to share their questions, you can raise your hand and call on you as well. The next question from Ethan, did part of the research include looking at differences among age generations? Interested if an ideal candidate scores trended the same way for Gen Z versus other generations, or if there were other meaningful differences?
So that is a great question. We don't look at it here, but in principle we could. And I would be very surprised if we didn't find something interesting there on the age dimension. This is, a big pivot point in a lot of sort of internal party debates. Now that I have the slide up, I can show you that we also see sort of, rather, you're asking about, do people of different ages have different preferences, but we do have here that Democratic primary voters have preferences over age. Getting to that point about looking ahead and Joe Biden's age, Democratic primary voters do not like candidates over 75. We see pretty strong preferences against nominating older candidates, and consistently, they are also seen as less electable. So that's a real thing that could be leveraged in a competitive race. Just right now, we don't have a competitive race. No.
Next question from Amelia. Have you considered weighting the YouGov sample to mirror demographic balance of swing states?
So we didn't do that here. And I think in part because we're looking at, sort of a national primary electorate. So the relevant states would be different. But it is an interesting question, right? Like there's no such thing as like a national primary. We have a collection of state primaries. So there is, I think, if we looked at, if you just ran this in the early states, right, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, things like that, would the results be different? I think that's a great question. Generally, I just don't know. I don't know what to expect there with if the sort of more invested, attentive, electorate that's been exposed to retail politics might be thinking about this differently than someone in say Ohio, where they sort of tune in later. It's a great question.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Next question. What's your read on whether general electability is more important to one party than the other? Are Democrats generally more strategic than Republicans, or vice versa?
I think both parties care about electability. They may have very different theories about what it is to be electable. I think in the Democratic Party, I think the voters are a little more split on whether it's more important to compromise to get things done versus stick to your principles. I think we have a bit of a live debate over sort of how pragmatic to sort of moderate our issue stances. This debate plays out very publicly. And I think the Republican base is a little more committed to the idea that we should stick to our principles, that we should nominate true conservatives, that this is the way forward. So I don't think parties care less about electability, but I do think they have very different takes on sort of what an electable candidate looks like and sounds like, if that makes sense. And this gets back to I think Grossman and Hopkins, like the asymmetries in the party. To the extent that the Republican Party is different from Democrats, they're more ideological in how they think about politics. whereas Democrats are more of a collection of interest groups. And that leads them to, I guess, different rhetorical strategies as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, great observations. Next question is from Greg Hollick, our immediate past president for the chapter. Can you speak to the face validity of theoretical experiments? In 2016, it wasn't just any woman, it was Hillary Clinton, and it isn't just any Republican man, it's Donald Trump.
Yeah, so very hard to separate personality from all this, and sort of individual candidate characteristics. And this is part of what makes, sort of adjudicating between these competing narratives so hard, right? Is it gender, or is it Hillary Clinton was uniquely unpopular? And I think part of the value of running a conjoint experiment like this is to try to strip some of that, personal background out, and say, look, looking forward, if we were to abstract out from the specific candidates, what of these attributes independent from biographies do we care about? But I think this gets to the point I raised earlier about a limitation of, we can't fully abstract out of the context of the day this survey was fielded and what else was included on that survey. The 2020 election is on the mind, right? So I can't get inside the respondents' heads and know whether or not they're not thinking about Amy Klobuchar when they're evaluating a white woman profile, say. So generally speaking, I think, the easy answer here is that the conjoint design helps, in the sense of it gets you away from thinking about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, but I don't know if we can fully do that in practice.
I'll just ask a follow-up on that because it's been on my mind. Using these discrete choice experiments in the consumer market research context, be optimizing products and so on, and there's always a question about variables that we wish we could have included, but maybe there's not enough room in the design, or we don't want to overcomplicate it for the respondent, or it might be hard to articulate the variables in the experiment. So I'm just curious if you and your co-authors had any debates about other variables that you maybe wanted to include, or ones you wish you had included in retrospect.
I don't think there's anything so this is a fairly big survey, and this, comes at the end, so we could do a bunch of pre-treatment stuff. We didn't fully explore the suite of, things we could look at there. Although there's certainly there's interesting moderators in some of these first order effects. But there's, we probed a fair bit, how important is being a Democrat to your identity, various issue items, values, traits you look for in a candidate. There's a bunch of stuff we have pre-treatment to see, what moderates these effects, and we just didn't fully explore that here. But one thing we don't have that I really would love is who'd you actually vote for at the end of the day? And we just didn't get that third wave sort of post-election follow-up for that. But that would allow us to really nail are people who said they were voting for Elizabeth Warren in June of 2019, but expressed reservations about electability, are they the ones who flipped to Joe Biden? And we just couldn't quite nail that here, but it would be very cool to test.
Okay. Another comment from Andrew. I remember reading a study of ways women candidates try to neutralize concerns about electability, foreign policy experience, tougher on certain issues, etc. Is that something you've thought about testing?
So not here, but I'm really glad you brought that up, because this gets to the evidence or lack thereof that women and candidates of color face general election penalties. There are a couple of reasons that other folks have found as to why, and one of them is counter-stereotypical messaging. So Jen Cryer, who's I think she's still at USC, has a really interesting paper on this, looking at congressional campaign websites and the issues that women candidates emphasize relative to men, and particularly, emphasizing these kinds of issues to sort of push back against gendered stereotypes. Other reasons that get cited or sort of, empirically tested are that women tend to wait longer to run until they are more qualified. whereas men are more likely to just go for it. And so the men who wind up running are on average less qualified, less strong candidates than women. So it's not that the electorate isn't sexist. It's that the women who do get nominated have found ways to sort of accommodate or sort of account for that in their races. So by the time you get to the general election stage, those effects have kind of canceled out. Is kind of the going take in the literature on why we can't just say that Hillary Clinton lost because she's a woman, or we don't have good evidence that is in fact the case. But to get back to Greg's point, Hillary Clinton is one specific woman, and so we can't fully discount that those factors didn't matter in 2016. These are on average kinds of findings. Yeah.
Great. Other questions? A minute. I'll drop anything into the chat here. Why were the marginal means different?
Going back to what those were. So I'm not quite sure I follow. Oh, do you mean like between the two plots? Like why is one centered at 50 and one centered at 72?
I think that may be
okay. If that's what you mean by it, it's because the second question allowed for the respondent to say that both of these candidates would beat Trump. So these are Democrats. They're generally optimistic about beating Trump. So in the first order preference, you have to pick one or the other, which means that just mechanistically that'll put the average at 50, and everything else is sort of centered around 50. But when you can say, I think both of these candidates would win, or I think one or the other or neither, that allows the mean to go up. So, on average, a given, candidate A may have been thought to beat Trump 72% of the time.
So was it a different question then? It was the likelihood of beating Trump, or the first
so
question?
the marginal mean is centered around a higher number for that second question, because we don't force a choice of one or the other.
Okay. Maybe I was thinking about the other slide you had, but do you have some kind of a metric around the relative importance of the different variables that were in the conjoint experiment, that just sort of, maybe in that last slide you showed, I've sort of been fielding the questions here, but.
Yeah, so I guess, I don't have a kind of plotting all the variables against each other, which one kind of wins, so you can kind of sort of back it out from, just looking at the effect sizes. It looks like, extremely old is there's strong preferences against, but age has this interesting parabolic relationship. So if you just plugged the age in linearly, you might not see it. And again, I think it speaks to, we're showing the top line numbers here, but there's a lot of interesting heterogeneity under the hood, where different people have very strong preferences that might be just the opposite of someone else's strong preferences here.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. We're getting near the hour, so let's see some other questions here. Okay, here we've got a question from James. Not sure how the aggregate polling looks, but Nikki Haley has the strongest head-to-head against Biden in a recent poll, 6 points versus the next highest margin of 2 points. How might you intuit how these dynamics, minority identities in a primary, might be different between the Democratic and Republican primary electorates?
That's really interesting. And I think, for Nikki Haley, there are a couple things. She's got, relatively high name ID. She was in the Trump administration. She's been a governor. And she's younger, and she's a woman, and all these things I think do interesting things in terms of her not being the kind of Republican that you might expect coming out of this primary field, right, or this primary electorate. So what I would be really curious about, and this is something that I think went a little bit unnoticed in 2016, is how the national electorate would place her on a left-right scale. Is she seen as closer to the center than some of the other candidates in the field? So in 2016, Trump gets located as more of a moderate by the national sort of electorate, in part because he kind of scrambles the policy space, right? He says he's for raising taxes on the rich. He's against cutting Social Security and Medicare. He doesn't seem to care about abortion as deeply as some of the other candidates, and gets attacked from the right as being, not very conservative on these things, and winds up as a result, creating the sort of appearance of being a bit more of a moderate in the general electorate, which is, I guess, a thing I didn't put up there as a plausible reason why he might have won in 2016. And then after he becomes president and governs more like a normal Republican, that sort of shifts back. But I think there are certain things about Nikki Haley that do sort of present as more moderate than some of the other candidates. In part, she's taking a more moderate tack on abortion. She had taken a more moderate tack on sort of the Confederate flag when there was hate crime in South Carolina. She's criticized Trump, and one of the more important sort of findings for understanding the Republican primary, in my view, is Dan Hopkins and Hans Knoll's work on how the meaning of conservatism has changed to shift around Trump, and how supportive of Trump you are. That's just come to definitionally be what it means to be a conservative. So if you criticize Trump, you are seen as more moderate, regardless of your issue stances. So Nikki Haley's got a lot sort of pushing in that direction on a variety of different dimensions. And, identity is certainly one of them. But it's also been interesting to see how the Republican primary electorate has responded on a kind of first order dimension of, do they think that the Republican primary is ready to nominate a woman from an underrepresented background, things of that nature, as well. But, maybe I asked my students, that I'm teaching campaigns and elections this semester, and I asked, we were talking about parties, and, asked them if the Republican Party, just the elites, could just get in a room and not have to worry about the electorate, like, who would they nominate? And Nikki Haley's name came up. She wasn't the only name that came up. Glenn Youngkin came up, some other sort of candidates who have conservative credentials but can present as moderate to the general electorate came up as, if we had a smoke-filled room, didn't have to worry about an electorate that really likes Donald Trump, and just put someone forward who we thought could win and satisfy sort of the core constituencies in the party base, she'd be high on the list.
John, it's fantastic how you got what happened historically led you into this survey experiment, and then all the insights that you're pulling out of it, along with the rest of what's going on in the field. It's super interesting. So appreciate all the commentary. One more question here. Have you thought about how these dynamics might work differently when both parties are without an incumbent?
That's a great question. We weren't thinking about it for this design because we were kind of, definitionally Trump's the incumbent, he's running. I think it gets more complicated if you aren't sure who the other party's nominee is going to be. Right? The other, if the say the Democrats and Republicans both have these wide open primaries and both are contested, and the front runners have very different backgrounds and identities and strategies and issue stances and things like that. Then the calculus gets harder. Which disadvantages for the other candidate are you going to try to exploit with yours, and things like that. How would the 2016 election have shaken out if the Republicans had nominated a more establishmenty, a Marco Rubio, right, who's quite different from Trump in a variety of different ways. Not obvious to me that he matches up against Hillary Clinton better than Trump does. So I don't know exactly how the dynamics would be different, but I suspect they get a lot more complicated from the perspective of a primary voter trying to do this calculus of who's the right, if I'm not going to just vote for my favorite person, who do I vote for instead? And then you could imagine that coming all the way back around and saying, I'm not going to bother with that calculus. I'm just going to nominate my favorite person and let the chips fall where they may. If the information gets too hard to sort of digest. So I don't have a great answer for that, but it's a really good question.
Yeah, those are great observations, and it sounds like that will be a great future paper.
Yeah,
That's
next time there's an open primary on both sides. Yeah, we can.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're just about at time here. A couple things. First of all, John, just thanks so much for presenting here with New York AAPOR. Really appreciate you sharing your research and your insights and commentary. Super interesting and engaging. So thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank everybody for joining the event tonight. And just to remind everybody to be sure to join New York AAPOR if you're not already a member, or to be sure to renew your membership. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and thanks for having me.